How did a 20-year-old prisoner of war locked in a dark cell without even a candle manage to bribe an American guard and launch a 250-mile manhunt across the New York wilderness? This is the story of Alexander Greig's Great Escape. So, how did this 20-year-old ensign end up in a Massachusetts prison? Alexander Greig was born in Quebec in 1793 and lived at 46 St. John Street. His father, James, was a merchant, a Freemason, and an ensign in the Quebec militia, but died when Alexander was just 3 years old, leaving his wife with 7 children to feed. At the outbreak of war in 1812 between the United States and Great Britain, Alexander had grown into a very solid young man. He was 5'9", stout and well-made, with a ruddy complexion. He was given an ensigncy in the 8th or King's Regiment, which was part of the Quebec garrison, and he wouldn't have to wait long to see action. On April 27, 1813, just after his 20th birthday, the Americans landed at York and Alexander was in the thick of the fighting, serving with No. 3 Company. He was in a gun battery when a portable powder magazine exploded, sending burned and mangled bodies flying through the air. Alexander barely escaped death, and if you're interested in that full story, click up here. Pushed out of York, Alexander was forced to retreat 165 miles to Kingston, where a month later he joined the attack on Sackett's Harbor. He was wounded during the battle and was taken prisoner along with several other officers from his regiment. First, he was sent to Brownville, about 10 miles away from the garrison, where he was paid every attention by the locals. After about 6 weeks, Alexander was then moved to Albany, where he was equally well treated before ending up in Cheshire. But this is where his treatment changes. Alexander felt he wasn't receiving the subsistence that he was due under the agreement between the United States and Great Britain. He believed his captors weren't living up to their obligations and returned his parole to Major Thomas Melville, who oversaw the vast prisoner of war camp network. Parole is an interesting concept to explore. An officer would pledge on his honor not to escape. In exchange, the officer would often be allowed to walk, hunt, and otherwise enjoy himself within a certain radius from the cantonment. Officers were kept separate from the men and, in this case, were quartered in houses at Cheshire while the men were kept separate in Pittsfield. So, with parole, they were prisoners, but prisoners with a whole lot of latitude. And Melville's policy was to beat the British with kindness. He wrote that the American government will pride itself on giving the examples of liberality to its enemy. But Alexander didn't see it that way, and by returning his parole, he forfeited any freedom allowed to him and, importantly, withdrew his promise not to escape. Major Melville moved quickly. The next day, Alexander was escorted to Pittsfield and locked in close confinement in prison. He was not given a knife or a fork, nor was he allowed candles or anything else to add to his comfort. He wasn't quiet about it either. He was threatened to be put in irons and have his rations cut to a third if he kept speaking with the sentries. He wanted to get out. While in close confinement, Alexander met another young officer, Walter Kerr. Standing at 6'1", Walter was another Canadian-born soldier who was a lieutenant in the green-coated Glengarry Light Infantry. Walter had been taken prisoner at the capture of Fort George on May 27th, where he was fighting literally for his home. He had been born in the town of Niagara, right next to the fort, and his father still lived there. He and Alexander had much to talk about. A number of officers from the 8th Foot had been promoted to the Glengarrys, so they had many friends and connections in common. In addition, Walter's father was a Freemason, just like Alexander's, and together they plotted their escape. Their plan was to bribe a guard and make a run for it. On September 21st, 1813, they waited until nightfall and made their move. Once their escape was noticed, the commandant, Major Melville, sprang into action. A search was called and the word was spread across Massachusetts and New York. A reward of $100 was offered for the capture of either prisoner. 115 days after his capture, Alexander Greig was free, but he was deep in enemy territory. Montreal, the closest friendly city, was 250 miles away. Exactly how the two officers made it is a mystery lost to time. But by October 4th, Alexander was in Montreal and sat down to write a report on his treatment while a prisoner of war. Think about it. That means Alexander and Walter covered about 20 miles a day through enemy territory and rugged wilderness with a $100 bounty on each of their heads. That's incredible. And a surprise was waiting for him at Montreal. He had been promoted to lieutenant a few months earlier. By December, Alexander was back with his regiment at York, where I'm sure a few stories were told over some drinks. If you want to learn more about Alexander, watch this video up here where I break down his eyewitness letter about the Battle of York. Thanks for watching, hit subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. See you next time.